Good morning and welcome to the Hibs Observer Transfer Window Review with myself, Liam Bryce, joined by Patrick McPartlin and Jack Harris. To look back over the month that was at Easter Road, a very busy end to January, February indeed, for Hibs. Multiple signings over the line and a few departures as well. So we're going to look back in as much detail as we can over all of that and see where it leaves David Gray placed for the rest of the season. Patrick, a busy night down at Easter Road last night. 3 incomings on deadline day, 3 departures as well, 2 permanent, 1 on loan. We'll get into specifics in due course, but what do you make of the January window now that it's all done and dusted?
Certainly finished with something of a bang, as you kind of alluded to there. I think 6 signings in total on a busy final day, especially when you consider kind of more recent deadline days that have been relatively quiet in comparison. But I think there's a lot of excitement probably from the signings. So I think on paper look like good additions, interesting profiles, especially when you look at the likes of Garen Anga and what he'll bring in his experience, and just adding apparently as many forwards to the squad as possible and seeing where it takes you. I think if we kind of had one kind of ongoing criticism of Hibs, perhaps it was that they were creating a lot of chances, but not quite taking them or not putting them away. And I think when you look at the profile of the forwards who've been brought in, very different types of players, but I think it'll be interesting to see how David Gray utilises them, what they can bring, the combinations that you can have. Because it's not just that they've gone out and they've got another kind of, Bowie copy. They have sort of brought in 2 or 3 players who do have slightly different profiles. And I think when we look at Klidje going out late last night and Junior Hoylett leaving, then I think it became apparent why Hibs were apparently stockpiling forwards. And I think it'll be interesting to see if the sort of new signings do kind of take Hibs over that line a little bit to where they want to be in terms of having that sort of strong right-hand side midfielders past that coming in, beefing up the centre-back positions a little bit, and a lot of variety in the forward line, which we've talked about Hibs' shape and system before, and I think having a lot of forwards who are able to play in more than one position definitely kind of gives the opportunity to play slightly different systems depending on the opposition. So 3-5-2, obviously 3-4-3, potentially 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1. Lots of options there for David Gray, and I think on balance, we'll hear from David Gray later today at his pre-match press conference ahead of tomorrow's game against Dundee United. But I think he'll be quite pleased with what Hibs have managed to do. His big thing is leaving a transfer window stronger than you went into it, and I think certainly on paper at least, it looks like Hibs have done exactly that. Yeah,
certainly a busy end. And as you said there, just an influx of forwards. So Jack, I think I saw you use the word sort of stagnant to describe Hibs in recent weeks, at least before the Rangers game. So now, going forward, there is almost a completely new look forward line there. Kieran Bowie's left, Dane Scarlett's come in, Ante Souto, Owen Elding. It looks completely different. So, for you, are you expecting these guys to breathe a bit of life into that forward line? Is this the kind of spark, the injection of life that Hibs might need in those forward areas? Because as Patrick said there, and it was certainly the case against Rangers at the weekend, there's chances created hasn't been a problem for Hibs, but putting them in the back of the net certainly has been.
Yeah, I think you can maybe even take that Rangers game as a microcosm of what's to come. And I mean this in no disrespect to Martin Boyle and Eliu Anatol, who were the 2 forwards in the first half going into the second half. But we did Hibs looked like they provided a slightly different threat going into those last 30 minutes. And I think when you look at the forwards, so it was Elding and Scarlett at the time, obviously 2 young forwards, neither of whom had a huge amount of game time in the weeks preceding the transfers. So I think the Elding chance right towards the end stands out as probably, the moment that could have won Hibs the game. I think with a bit more sharpness, we'll start to see those moments turn into goals. So I think exactly like you say, chances have not been a problem. And I think the more game time, the more match fitness, the more match sharpness they get into their legs, then that's going to be a brilliant thing. And then obviously bringing Ante Souto in as well seems a very smart piece of business. He's a profile that I think we've we've lacked since Miko Kuharevic left last season. Just one of these players that can get into the 6-yard box and score you those goals. All of the videos I've watched of him getting onto the end of crosses well, good with his head. And I mean, it's only a sample of his game time over the past 6 or 7 seasons, but it seems like any time he gets into the 6-yard box, then there's a goal or at least a good chance coming from it. So I think bringing in a player of his caliber will be fantastic in terms of turning those chances into something tangible at the end of a game.
Yeah, absolutely. And Patrick, I mean, I think maybe arguably the one that stands out from yesterday is bringing in Manash Garananga. I mean, because a lot of the focus, I think, over the last few weeks was, Hibs need a striker, Hibs need a new right wing back. And it had been kind of suggested that a defender, might be on the cards. I mean, especially as we said last night, after Jack Mitchell left, David Gray didn't rule out the possibility of going for someone of that in that position. But I think I was maybe thinking that, if you're going to replace Zach Mitchell, is it going to be someone of a similar profile in the sense that, Mitchell was a young player looking for, game time, didn't quite work out for him. But I mean, and bringing in somebody like Garananga, I mean, he's coming from Copenhagen, a big club in Denmark. He's got Champions League experience, played in the Europa League, Conference League, 17 international caps for Zimbabwe. He's played at AFCON. I mean, you look at his profile and his pedigree and you think that's a guy who's immediately coming in and challenging for a place in the starting 11, or probably a guy who I'd think will expect to come in and start in this Hibs team.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we're starting to see a bit of a trend with Hibs signings where, previously on deadline days, it would maybe be, it maybe be like a kind of clutch of players from maybe the EFL. Now we're sort of seeing Hibs, go a wee bit more global in the search for players who can come in and improve the squad. I always think, it's always interesting to think back to Ian Gordon's comments from, I think it was the kind of big interview he did was it last year, the year before, when he was sort of talking about recruitment at Hibs. And I think the exact phrasing was something along the lines of, we tried to go too global too soon. And that was when you saw them bringing in the likes of Elias Melkerson, Runar Hauge, popping around different countries, bringing, players in. And it maybe, the idea was right, but the timing wasn't. And I think, we saw, what I think is quite interesting is, when you look at last summer and the fact that Hibs sort of did seem to bring in a lot of players with, if not Scottish football experience, then it was UK football experience. And, you look at most of the lineups these days that Hibs put out, and very few of them have come, without any experience of the British game. And I think that's obviously something that the club was trying to head towards, I think. But it feels like David Gray talks a lot about the dressing room, talks a lot about the group, talks a lot about protecting the group and the team spirit they have. So there are a lot of moving parts when you try to sign players. But I think it is interesting that we are starting to see Hibs go a little bit further afield now in terms of bringing signings in. I mean, I know the West Coast of Ireland isn't particularly, that far from Easter Road, but, going to the League of Ireland, you go into the Danish League. I know they went there this time last year to bring in Alassane Mane, but then they've gone to the Croatian League as well. They've, been, I think, linked with players from other overseas leagues. So I think it's interesting just that, the net is being cast a little bit wider. Felix Passlack coming in from Germany is another one. We've seen other clubs in Scotland have success by, going to leagues in other countries and, picking up players who kind of, fit the profile of what they want in the team and can, adapt fairly well to Scottish football. And I think, when Hibs have gone overseas previously, I think more often than not it has worked. Like, there's always going to be those signings that don't quite work out. I think Malcolm Mackay's line at one of the AGMs recently was, you want to get 7 out of every 10 signings to be a success, which is, a decent hit rate. And I think if you look at who Hibs have brought in, if you look at the, if you look at, for example, the last 10 signings, it probably is there or thereabouts in terms of, 6 or 7 who have been broadly a success. And that's obviously not counting this, this current window. And I think it's it almost feels like, Hibs did sort of have to go back to the start a little bit, just kind of start again and just work out what they want to do in terms of recruitment, because at one point you had this bloated squad that had players from, I think, 3 or 4 different managers, and it was, I think, just about trying to get out of this cycle of a new manager every sort of 9 or 10 months, a new group of players, and like a huge playing squad with some players who don't fit the style of play that the manager wants his team to play. Maybe aren't happy with the lack of game time, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's been really interesting seeing Hibs going for a little bit of variety in the players they're targeting. And I think we know how difficult the January transfer window is, according to the teams, according to the club officials. But I think it's quite interesting to focus almost entirely on players with that UK experience in the summer, and then to sort of go a little bit further afield in January. It's an interesting kind of mix. And I think it does feel a little bit like Hibs kind of dipping their toe back into, bringing more players in from further afield, because we can get sort of bogged down in the debate about how many Scottish players you want starting in teams. Dundee United got slammed, I think, for naming a lineup that didn't have any Scots in it earlier this season. And I think ultimately, I think people, fans want their team to be as good as it can be, and if that means going further afield for signings, then so be it. So I think Garnag, a very interesting signing. I think Paslak will be an interesting signing. Suto is one. Excuse me, losing my voice, been talking too much. Suto's another one who I think is just that really, really kind of interesting profile, and it'll be really interesting to see how they kind of adapt to Scottish football, because there have been 1 or 2 signings recently. Thibaut Klidje is one, Alassane Amani's maybe another one, that haven't quite fit into Scottish football in the way that the club might have wanted them to. So there probably will be more due diligence done, and I think interesting to see how Hibs are kind of sharpening the recruitment all the time.
Yeah, definitely, Jack. Well, actually, we folks, if you're tuning in again from last night, we spoke fairly in depth about Felix Paslak and Ante Suto when they were announced last night. So we'll not cover that ground again. You can, if you want to hear about those two, you can tune into last night's show. We'll not go over those again this morning, just for the sake of anybody who might be tuning in again and who's heard it all before. But Jack, I think we were on last night. Hibs had not yet announced the departure of Junior Hoylett. He has gone to Swindon Town on a permanent deal. Excuse me. Agreeing the mutual termination of his contract so he could go and seek some game time. It's absolutely no secret. He's spoken about it multiple times that he still has 2 eyes, I think, firmly fixed on being in the candidate squad for the World Cup. So he's gone in search of game time. It seemed Hibs, only too happy to accommodate that request, given that I think that his prospects of game time, again, given the recruitment, players coming back, were probably pretty low in the second half of the season. But I mean, I have to ask Jack, I think he provided some really good moments when he was here in a Hibs shirt. You can tell it's such a classic footballer. You didn't play much this season, but you're disappointed to see Junior Hoylett leave the building.
I can understand why Junior has. Just purely like you say, 2 eyes on the World Cup in 2026, and I think especially with the arrival of Jamie McGrath, those moments that he's been able to provide have been more limited this season. Obviously, a couple of moments towards the end of last season, I think I said exactly the same on Twitter yesterday, that he was a real moments player, and when Hibs needed a moment of quality, a good goal, or just a good touch or a pass, Junior Hoylett was the perfect person to deliver that. Bits that stand out. There was a goal at Tannadice, and I think the one at Easter Road against St Johnstone as well. That was quite a special moment. But looking towards the last 6 months, when you've only got the league to play for, I guess, then it's going to be more difficult for squad rotation to really benefit Junior Hoylett. And I think if Junior needs the minutes to make it into that Canada squad, then he's a great professional, and by all accounts, everybody around the club has talked about the influence he's had off the pitch as well, just in terms of that experience of the game and what he can provide to the younger players at Hibs. So I think he'll be very much missed in that regard. And if there have been struggles for those sort of moments of quality, and you do think if Hibs can bring on a junior Hoylett, then that's the sort of thing you'll see a bit more of. So I wonder if maybe Hibs will suffer in that regard slightly, but in general, I think it's a great decision for the player. The club remains to be seen, but I think Hibs have the quality now in that area, going ahead into the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I think maybe this season possibly was just maybe one too far for Junior Hoylett. I thought he was at times at the back half of last season on that run. There were games where he was absolutely excellent. I love how it's just so obvious. Like sometimes if you didn't know who Junior Hoylett was, but like 5 minutes of watching him, you'd be able to, this guy's played at a really, really high level. He might be, 34, 35 now, but, the touch, the awareness, the movement, that just that never goes. And I think there was times across the back half of last season where he was brilliant to watch. And I think just, again, with the way Hibs have maybe tried to move and play this season, it's the room for him hasn't been there. He hasn't really made that impact off the bench. And I think maybe with him moving on, I think with Rudy Molotnikov coming back into the squad from injury probably maybe clears a wee bit of a pathway for him to try and make an impact. Again, obviously he was brought on ahead of Hoylett at the game at the weekend, which shows he's probably, he very much seems to be in David Gray's thoughts. So that's probably one to watch over the remainder of the season to see how he reintegrates back into the squad after having a bit of a torrid time with injury. Patrick, but we'll move on to really big news. Well past midnight last night, I must say. Kind of an inkling that there might be something happening on the Thibaut Klidje front yesterday. So it proved to be. He's gone to Denmark on loan with FC Randers. It's a dangerous one to be typing and saying that in the context of Scottish football, because you get one letter wrong. And they are very close to each other on the keyboard, and it takes on a very different perception. So no, he has not gone to Rangers. Thibaut Klidje, he has gone to Randers in Denmark, and it seems to be the Danish club have an option to buy Hibs club record signing, who only arrived in Edinburgh about 6 months ago. It's been a difficult few months for him. He's not gotten a run in the team at all. Starting games here and there. I think maybe so it's like 5-7 games in the league, around about that number. But I mean, he's not had he's not had a consistent run at it for one reason or another. Across that first half of the season, David Gray very much preferring Kieran Bowie and Martin Boyle in that role. There've been times of late if Bowie or before he departed or Boyle weren't available, David Gray was going with Elie Youan ahead of Thibaut Klidje, so you could sort of see him sort of gradually slipping down that pecking order, despite, as I said, being Hibs record signing. And it's not a great outcome, really, is it, Patrick, to bring in a guy for that kind of money just a few weeks ago? No, a few weeks ago. It feels like a few weeks ago.
Like a few weeks ago.
A few months ago, sorry. And, come January, you're shipping him out on loan with, and that option to buy, that kind of tells you an awful lot about where Hibs see his future, doesn't it? So it's not a great one from that point of view, and just pretty disappointing considering the level of excitement there was about Hibs, splashing that kind of cash on a player. Thibaut Klidje, he looked, he had a good time over in Switzerland. He looked like a player on the up, but it's just not worked out at all, really, has it?
It's not, no, and it's what I was saying earlier about Hibs trying to get 7 out of every 10 signings right. Like, it's not a bad hit rate. But if the signings that aren't really working out are the ones that, are kind of having the most money spent on them, we think, Alassane Amani cost 6 figures, Dylan Vente cost high 6 figures, didn't really work out for him either. And, you can talk about how managers play players, you can talk about, taking time to settle, you can talk about them sort of maybe not adapting to the country properly. I mean, everyone is different, when it comes to football. Some players, are quite happy to bounce around from team to team, from country to country, and without any real kind of problem settling, no matter where it is. And others, maybe just either need a bit of time to settle, or for whatever reason it just doesn't click. And I think that the disappointing thing is that when we saw sort of flashes of Klidje towards the start of the season, and we were being told that, they were just kind of managing his minutes and just sort of drip feeding him almost into Scottish football. I think maybe, when the club has spent money before on players, and it has been quite a large outlay, you can go back to Melkerson, Vente's another one. It does sort of put an awful lot of pressure, not only on the player, but on the club as well. And, obviously if you're spending, that much money on a player, you're kind of expecting them to come in and hit the ground running. And, we did see flashes of it. I mean, certainly, he's got an eye for goal. He, the 5 goals he scored, he did 4 goals, 5 goals. 4 goals he scored, there were some pretty good ones in there. But I think, you talked about this before, I think, in one of the pieces you wrote, Liam, that it kind of seemed to be his work off the ball, that David Gray wanted more from him. And I think, I think it's interesting because you do see a lot of people talking about David Gray and saying, he prefers his pals. That's the kind of the criticism levelled at him. That's playing players like Martin Boyle and, bringing Joe Newell back in, that sort of thing. And I think that it's not so much like an old pals act. I think it's more likely to be, I think that David Gray wants players who he can trust. And I don't mean that in a sort of, that he doesn't trust the other players, but he can trust them to go out, to implement the game plan, to do what he needs them to do, to, press in the right way, to, chase the right sort of balls. Movement's got to be spot on. And I just sort of feel that, it never really seemed to click with Klidje. And, it could be the style of coaching. It could be, all manner of reasons for that. But it did sort of seem, I think you played them against Dunfermline, Kieran Bowie. I think that was a bit of a mistake. I'm not sure the two of them had really played together all that much, and it just didn't seem to be a lot of. It just didn't seem to work out. There wasn't a lot of cohesion up front. I think the pair combined once for a chance that Klidje put into the side netting, and it just. I think when we saw Ellie Youan starting to get more and more minutes, and we looked at the vast sort of numbers of forwards brought in, you did sort of start to think that if anybody was going to be leaving from the forward line, apart from Junior Hoyle, then Klidje looked like the most obvious candidate. And I think that's because for all his sort of mercurialness and all his sort of tendency to go well. I think with Ellie Youan, sometimes he can create something out of nothing, or he can create nothing out of something. You never really know what you're going to get. But crucially, I think David Gray does seem to trust him to play the way he wants. You saw the way he played against Rangers on Sunday. He was sort of chasing balls. He was closing players down. Obviously last season there was that little bit where it seemed like he was getting involved in confrontations with fans, like online and like after the games and things like that every week. But he's kind of knuckled down, and I think he's an exciting player to watch. And you kind of feel like when he gets the ball, like he'll make something happen. There was that point on Sunday where I think Barlasser passed to Andrews. Andrews passed out to Youan, and he sort of hit the byline, put a cross in, and Joe Newell was very unlucky not to get a header on target. So it's just that I think he fits the way that David Gray wants to play. He's obviously trusted to do what David Gray wants him to do, and it just feels that that's maybe been a bit missing with Klidje. And he spoke after one of the games, I forget which one, and he spoke about the language barrier and not fully understanding David Gray at times, and just that sort of thing. So it does seem like one of those situations where he hasn't settled, it just hasn't worked out for whatever reason. Going to Randers, he's kind of getting a fresh start in a different league. There's not that sort of pressure of being a kind of club record signing, and it's I suppose it's a chance for him to get a regular run of games to rediscover his mojo, if you like. And as you say, that kind of option to buy is interesting because that to me sort of suggests that Hibs wouldn't be too unhappy if Randers said we'd like to sign him on a permanent deal, and then they can obviously talk. They can talk terms. And if he comes back to Hibs, then you potentially got a player in there who feels he has a point to prove, which could be good for him, could be good for Hibs. So I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on how he does in the Super League over the sort of second half of the season. I think Randers quite an interesting team just because of the sort of quite quite a sort of varied squad in terms of the background. It's not not a sort of primarily kind of Danish squad. There are players from a number of different countries, and that might sort of work for him, just having that sort of atmosphere, that environment to kind of rediscover his mojo, like I said. But yeah, I think definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on, especially so because of the outlay spent, as you say, just 6 months ago.
Yeah, as a disappointing one. I think you kind of alluded to it there, that we did sort of write recently, because we were trying to, puzzle out reasons why it wasn't quite working for him. And I think that there did seem to be maybe like I'm not saying like a misunderstanding, but it was though sort of watching Klidje at times during games as if he wasn't quite as in tune with the system as maybe some of the other players were. And I think it's so obvious that David Gray puts very specific and pretty high demands on players off the ball. And certainly from what I could see during games is that he seemed to be very, I'm not saying he was going ballistic on the touchline, David Gray, but there was a lot of, instruction towards Klidje, or, after things had happened, you could see he was remonstrating to be in this position or to anticipate that ball. It was the game against Aberdeen at home just after Christmas, and there was a kind of lot of communication, shall we say, from the touchline towards Thibaut Klidje. I think I said to you at the time, Patrick, it was kind of reminiscent of, if anybody remembers when, I think particularly at away games at times when Nick Montgomery was the manager and Elie Youan was playing, there was just above the crowd so often throughout these games, all you could hear when Hibs were out of possession was just Nick Montgomery shouting Elie, Elie, Elie over and over and over, booming right across the stadium as if there was nobody else on the pitch. It was just like this kind of ongoing thing between Nick Montgomery and Elie Youan. I don't think it was quite to that extent with Gray and Thibaut Klidje, but it was as if it was just you were kind of watching a player who wasn't quite as in tune with the manager's system as the coach wanted them to be. Just wee subtle things, maybe just not reacting to making, for example, I think there was a couple of times where I think it was Warren O'Hora playing right centre back that night. He was getting the ball in that position, looking to step forward. He's looking up and he's looking for a run into the channel, which even if Martin Boyle is not having the best of games, Martin Boyle will make that run into the channel. And there was a couple of times where you could see O'Hora sort of remonstrating towards Klidje as well. I need you to go there when I've got the ball. Just wee things like that, as if it just never quite clicked with Thibaut Klidje. But I think maybe the counterpoint to this, Jack, for potentially a wee bit of balance, I think if you're Thibaut Klidje, are you potentially thinking, well, if you come into a new environment, new country, new team, new coach, and you don't get an extended run in the side, is it maybe from his point of view being, well, how can you adjust if you're not given that consistent run to learn on the job? Do you feel a wee bit for him in that sense that he never got the run? Or from your point of view, is it you thinking, well, maybe he didn't do enough to earn that? Where do you come down on that argument? I
think there was the argument when Klidje started getting good runs in the team, and I mean it's like the song goes, scoring all the time, Thibaut Klidje. It seemed like any time he was on the pitch, he'd have a goal, and I think round about then he was maybe showing what he could do for Hibs. But I mean, I echo what both you and Patrick have said, that it does look like that lack of understanding has affected him. He also seems quite a shy, reserved character. I think when you join a team and you've got the pressure sort of around your neck saying you are the club record signing, and I think fans have been quite patient with him, but there is always that expectation that a club spends that amount of money, particularly on a striker, and suddenly, if you're not scoring a hat-trick every week, then are you really justifying that amount of money being spent? And I think when you're a character that maybe hasn't adjusted to the dressing room as quickly as others might, I don't know Thibaut Klidje at all, but at least the way he comes across in interviews and his demeanour, he does seem like quite a shy, sort of humble, really nice character. And it's not always the easiest to adjust in a social situation when you do have that pressure on your shoulders. And so I think going away and getting those minutes would be great. I read the press release as there is a good chance that he'll be back at HTC come July. It's that comment, Patrick, you made in our group chat saying that, Malky Mackay was saying, I'll be keeping in constant contact with him. It doesn't seem at all like this is a player that Hibs have given up on or sort of sent away to be a permanent Randers player come July or August. But I think it is maybe getting game time, getting minutes, getting confidence as much as anything, and then trying to bring that back. And like you say, maybe he'll have a point to prove, and that isn't always the worst thing in the world. But I'm not sure, at least from what I can glean from Thibaut, that he'd be one of these people. Like, well, I'm not getting game time, so I'm gonna leave. I'm not interested in this anymore. It does seem like he's got his head in the right place, and that humility is a great asset. But it can also be damaging in some ways when you're not doing well and you don't necessarily have that sort of swagger, that ego to say, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to show you guys. He doesn't seem like that character. And I wonder if maybe that's affected him somewhat. He does seem like he has a great connection with Ellie Yuan, who we've mentioned. I mean, there have been a couple of games that the two of them have played briefly up top together. And I mean, the Aberdeen one stands out, obviously Ellie getting the assist for Klidje's goal. But I thought, was it Kilmarnock as well that they spent some time playing alongside each other, maybe? I think so. And obviously we saw how well Ellie played in that game. And I thought Klidje had a better impact on the game than some of his other performances. So maybe there's a good friendship between those two. We never know where Ellie Yuan's going to be, but hopefully when and if Klidje comes back in the summer, that will be something that can be beneficial for the team, I think.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see how over the next few months. But as you say, it will be really interesting to see what happens come the summer, especially if Klidje does well over in Denmark. It creates a decision to make for all parties in that sense. So I'm just having a wee look. Why don't we? Shall we? Let's finish on a question, shall we? This one was a wee bit different from Scott McKenzie, 1400, and he says, from a journalist point of view, what's a transfer deadline day like? As frantic as it always seems. It can be, can't it? But at the same time, I think maybe what people don't always see is there can be an awful lot of waiting around at the same time for people to get in touch, waiting for things that you think are going to happen, waiting for confirmation, waiting to be confident enough to say that it's going to happen. And then I think, as we saw last night towards the end of the day, Patrick, everything can then happen at once, can't it?
It can, yeah. And what you've also got is the fact that on transfer deadline day, probably more than any other day in football, things can change so quickly. I mean,
yeah,
just thinking back, players turning up at sort of teams' grounds to kind of try and force moves through, or players sort of just waiting at the airports, that sort of stuff. It all sounds, I was going to say glamorous, that's exactly the wrong word. It all sounds sort of quite kind of frantic and last minute and chaotic. And I think quite often it isn't maybe quite as chaotic as it's sort of it's made out to be. I think there is an awful lot of kind of dramatizing of deadline day to create it into this sort of frenzied sort of final few hours. But I think the interesting thing for me is that you can spend sort of like a good few hours trying to get bits and pieces here and there, from various sources. Is this happening? When's it going to happen? Is it likely to happen? And you can go from sort of thinking that a move is about to transpire, and then at the very last minute, another team comes in and says, well, we're going to offer you £1,000 more, a week, or a larger transfer fee. And I think that quite often, things kind of, the sort of things change very, very quickly in that sense. But I think, yeah, you're right. There is an awful lot of waiting around. You can spend like large swings of transfer deadline day almost kind of twiddling your thumbs, for want of a better description, and then there will maybe be a sort of a couple of hours where it's extremely frantic, and that's just because of how things work. At other ends, other teams, we know how often David Gray's talked about this and said that you have to be prepared to sort of spring into action with barely any warning. So I always quite enjoy them. I think just because they are different. I mean, 2 deadline days every year, they are different to sort of most other days. in the job, and it can be quite exciting when you're sort of trying to find out all this information about a player. You're trying to see what stats are out there, what their kind of pedigree is, where they've been previously, and that if you're a bit of a kind of football geek like me, then that's ideal. But certainly, I do think it's almost sexed up a little bit at times to be something that it isn't. And I think it's always helped by if Hibs are busy, if there's like yesterday when you've got sort of 3 signings coming in, when you've got signings leaving as well, players leaving as well, then when there's plenty to do, then it does seem like an enjoyable kind of 20 hours or whatever it is. But if it's a quiet day, then it can be a little bit, you almost feel like you've wasted a day. So yeah, if it's busy, then it can be quite enjoyable, and if it isn't, then it does seem to drag a little bit, and you kind of become aware of the hours sort of ticking by slower and slower. But I mean, that's just me. I could be completely on board with that one.
I think if I was to just sum it up briefly, I think what kind of stands out about it at times is that things that would maybe normally transpire over the course of a couple of days can then transpire over the course of a couple of hours. It's very changeable, it's very fluid, and I think that's what makes it, when things are happening, that's what makes it very exciting. But yeah, I mean, you get through it, you survive, and we're still here. We're here to tell the tale the next morning. But for now, I think we've covered pretty much everything that went on yesterday, went on before that. Hibs transfer window in a nutshell over the last 35 minutes or so. So I think we're going to leave it there. As Patrick alluded to earlier on, David Gray will be speaking to the press this afternoon because Hibs are back in action tomorrow night at home to Dundee United. So I'd imagine, I don't know if there'll be too many questions put to the manager on tomorrow night's game. I'd imagine today's press conference will be pretty focused on the outstanding questions from transfer deadline day and indeed earlier in the month. He's got new signings to talk about. He's got players leaving to talk about. So we'll be getting David Gray's thoughts on all that and more. And as well, importantly, there'll probably be at least an injury update or two after the weekend. Hopefully Hibs have got a few more players back in and around the squad for tomorrow night's game, because it's another important game, because we all know what game's coming after this one. So it's obviously important to go into the Edinburgh Derby on a high. So thank you for joining us this morning, folks. We appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate you tuning in last night as well and reading the stuff on the website. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully it was insightful and kept you informed all the way to the deadline and beyond last night. To be honest, because we went well past the finishing line with some of those announcements. But it's back to sort of match business for Hibs tomorrow night. So hopefully
the bread and butter.
That's it. Yeah, we'll end on that. Thanks again for joining us, folks. We'll speak to you soon. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. As I said, we'll speak to you soon. Cheers.